Chapter 14. Medicine for the Body, Politic. Start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible. And suddenly, you're doing the impossible. St. Francis of Assisi. Carl Johnson, a clinical psychologist, retired from a career as a PTSD specialist with the Veterans Administration and has frequently traveled over the past decade to the sites of some of the world's most terrible atrocities and disasters to provide a psychological support using energy psychology methods. About a year after NATO put an end to the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, Johnson found himself in a trailer in a small village where the brutalities had been particularly severe. A local physician who had offered to refer people in his village had posted a sign that treatments for war-related trauma, nightmares, insomnia, intrusive memories, inability to concentrate, etc., were being offered. Johnson described how, as a line of people had formed outside the trailer, the referring physician told him with some concern that everyone in the village was afraid of one of the men who was waiting outside for treatment. The others in the line had actually positioned themselves as far away from this man as possible. Johnson asked the physician to invite the man into the trailer. And Johnson, who after a career in the VA is seasoned in working with war veterans, recalled that the man had a vicious look. He felt dangerous. But he had come for help, so with the physician translating, Johnson asked the man to bring to mind his most difficult memory from the war. Everyone in the village was haunted by traumas of unspeakable proportion. Torture, rape, witnessing the massacre of loved ones. As the man brought the trauma to mind, his face tensed and reddened, and his breathing quickened. Though he never put his memory into words, the treatment began. Johnson tapped on specific acupoints that he determined to be relevant to the trauma. He then instructed the man through the interpreter to do a number of eye movements and other simple physical activities designed to accelerate the process. Then more tapping. Within 15 minutes, according to Johnson, the man's demeanor had changed completely. His face had relaxed and his breathing normalized. He no longer looked vicious at all. In fact, he was openly expressing joy and relief. He initiated hugs with both Johnson and the physician. Then, still grinning, he abruptly walked outside, jumped into his car, and roared away, as everyone watched, rather perplexed. The man's wife was also in the group waiting for treatment. In addition to the suffering she had faced during the war, she had become a victim of her husband's rage. The traumas that she identified also responded rapidly to the tapping treatment. About the time her treatment was completed, her husband's car roared back to the waiting area. He came in with a bag of nuts and a bag of peaches, both from his home, as unsolicited payment for his treatment. He was profuse and appeared gleeful in his thanks, indicating that he felt something deep and toxic had been healed. He hugged his wife then. Extraordinarily, he offered to escort Johnson into the hills to find trauma victims who were still in hiding, too damaged to return to life in their villages. Both his own people, ethnic Albanians, and the enemy Serbs. In Johnson's words, that afternoon, before our very eyes, we saw this vicious man, filled with hate, become a loving man of peace and mercy. Johnson further reflected how often this would occur, that when these traumatized survivors were able to gain emotional resolution on experiences that had been haunting them, they became markedly more loving and creative. Although survivors, even after a breakthrough session like this, are still left with the formidable task of rebuilding their lives, The treatment disengaged the intense limbic response from cues and memories tied to the disaster, freeing them to move forward more adaptively. The 105 people treated during Johnson's first 5 visits to Kosovo, all in 2000, had each been suffering for longer than a year from the post-traumatic emotional effects of 249 discrete, horrific, self-identified incidents. For 247 of those 249 memories, the treatments using TFT successfully reduced the reported degree of emotional distress, not just to the manageable level, but to a no distress level of 0 on the 0 to 10 SUD scale. Although these figures strain credibility, they are consistent with other reports. Approximately 3/4 of the 105 individuals were followed for 18 months after their treatments and showed no relapses. The original memory no longer activated self-reported or observable signs of traumatic stress. This story, written by clinical psychologist David Feinstein, Ph.D., for the peer-reviewed journal Traumatology, shows that by helping individuals, energy psychology promotes social good. Like emotional CPR, these methods can be used as an emergency medical intervention. If school children learn these techniques to help them cope with playground stresses, if hospital patients learn them to help cope with pain, if people in social crises use them to help stabilize their emotions, then panic and powerlessness would no longer thwart sensible action. The reservoir of sane, stable, intellectual, and emotional power that lies within us would be unlocked and brought to bear on the social problems that lie before us. Discontinuous social change. Just as sudden healing miracles are a possibility for our bodies, sudden social miracles are possible for our culture. We are living at a time of profound social discontinuity. Patterns that have been under the radar for hundreds or thousands of years are coming into the light of healing. Examples are all around us. For millennia, women were suppressed by society. In most countries, laws prevented them from having social status equal to that of men. Often, women were not allowed to own property. Often, they were treated as property. In Western societies, this has changed, all in just a century. In 1893, New Zealand became the first country to give women the right to vote in national elections. In Britain, women won the right to vote in 1918, 1920 in the United States. And in the second half of the 20th century, the women in most of the world's functioning democracies obtained similar rights. In most Western countries, women are now on a roughly equal social, financial, and political footing with men, at least on paper. This means that the vast creative potential of half of humankind, locked up for centuries, has suddenly become available to society. Women's rights are an example of discontinuous social change. Another example is incest and other forms of child abuse. For most of recorded history, children were entirely under the power of adults, even if they were being dreadfully abused. For centuries, children were roughly employed in mines in Britain, under the most appalling conditions, such as 16-hour shifts, carrying coal on their backs. Incest was such a taboo that it was not even discussed, and was often presumed not to exist. Suddenly, in the last 2 centuries, we have witnessed rapid, discontinuous social change. England passed the first child labor laws in 1802 and strengthened them throughout the century. In 1916, U.S. President Wilson pushed a child labor law through Congress, only to have it struck down by the Supreme Court. Finally, in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act came into force. Most Western countries also have movements protesting the importation of goods made with child or slave labor in other countries. Another is addiction. In the slums of London in the 1800s, a stereotype of the working man was that he got his wages on Friday, went to the pub, drank most of them away, and returned home to beat his wife and children. None of his neighbors thought that any of this behavior was amiss. Probably in Babylon 4,000 years ago, the same man could have received the same nods for the same behavior. Certain social norms have been static for thousands of years. Today, the same man might be going to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, whereas for centuries society tolerated addictive behavior and had few mechanisms for dealing with any but the most violent addicts. Today there are many interventions available. There are 12-step groups for many conditions, from compulsive shopping to gambling, to attention deficit disorder, and for those addicted to non-prescription painkillers. Many individuals have begun to confront addictions that in past centuries would have been considered socially normative. Taken collectively, they represent a society that is making a serious dent in its addictions. Another watchword of today's society is diversity. Today, multinational corporations find ways in which to turn multiculturalism into a benefit, to appreciate the diversity of employees and turn the diversity into a strength. Global companies spend millions of dollars training their employees to understand and appreciate the differences. Yet 100 years before, the corporate giants of the world, think railroad barons, sugar monopolies, the Dutch East India Company, Rockefellers and DuPonts or Henry Fords, production lines, prized uniformity, and the rewards of uniformity date back to the ancient Greeks, who grouped their soldiers into phalanxes rather than fighting in individual combat. As early as the 7th century BCE, uniformity of tactics gave these organized groups of soldiers, referred to in Homer's epics, an edge over their enemies fighting singly. Individuals lead society. Society has undergone another about-face when it comes to the expectation that people with cancer will die. I remember hushed conversations from my childhood that went something like this. The aunt, the doctor says it's cancer. Uncle, how long does he have? The only variable in their minds was how long the person would live. Cancer equaled death. No ifs, ands, or buts. It wasn't doctors who began to change that mindset, but patients who refused to die when confronted with these terminal diagnoses. There are now hundreds of books, articles, and research studies of exceptional cancer patients, those who, rather than accepting a death sentence, immediately began taking charge, discovering what they could do to help themselves, and nudging the quantum field and their cells in the direction of health. A similar phenomenon has happened with AIDS. Still officially incurable, there are an increasing number of anecdotes of patients who have later tested HIV negative after having been earlier diagnosed with AIDS. In the years after the first AIDS case was diagnosed in the United States, in June of 1981, most AIDS patients died quickly and horribly, and today there are some 500,000 people alive in the United States, many in excellent health, who have been diagnosed with AIDS at some point in the previous 20 years. Under the headline, First Case of HIV Cure Reported, November of 2005, doctors at London's Victoria Clinic announced that conclusive tests shown that Andrew Stimpson, who had twice tested positive for HIV infection, was now virus-free. DNA tests were used to confirm that there had been no mix-up in the samples, and society is changing its collective mind about HIV and AIDS being a death sentence, as certainly as it changed its mind about cancer, starting a generation ago. Many of the researchers mentioned in this book have been the target of ridicule, character assassination, or suppression. The American Psychological Association disallows all continuing education credits for any organization that offers even a single professional training in energy psychology. The Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology, ACEP, a professional organization for energy psychology, is governed by a group of licensed psychologists who has vigorously attempted to sabotage research projects if life coaches rather than psychologists provide energy psychology. Just as in the 18th century, Ignatius Semmelweis, a Viennese doctor, was ridiculed for suggesting that surgeons wash their hands before operations, or Edward Lister was pilloried for cleaning his hospital with carbolic acid disinfectant. The pioneers of the new medicine and new psychology have faced the entrenched opposition of their professions. Yet because these therapies work, and are often far more effective than anything conventional medicine has to offer, patients are voting with their feet and their dollars, dragging research along behind them and creating social mind change on the way. Epigenetic influence and wars between nations. A critical finding of gene methylation and acetylation studies is that once nurturing is done by one generation and those genes are expressed, then nurturing behavior and its accompanying gene expression can be passed to the next generation. Nurturing parents produce nurturing offspring, and neglectful parents produce neglectful offspring. What would happen if an entire population became less fearful and anxious, generation by generation? Would this result in less aggression, both within the society and toward the society's neighbors? Social scientists have found evidence of precisely these effects when studying conflicts between nations. Robin Grill, a psychologist from New Zealand, has done extensive surveys of the parenting literature of warlike populations. For instance, the most popular Prussian parenting manuals in the 19th century stressed that children should be absolutely obedient and that the most minor infraction should be punished with beating. Beating children several times a day was not uncommon and was not considered cruel. It was the accepted German 19th century paradigm of good parenting. Swiss psychiatrist Alice Miller points out that these children were rigidly obedient to authority, fighting the Franco-Prussian War successfully for the Germans, and then World Wars I and II unsuccessfully for the Germans, as faithful soldiers of any current government. Miller provides 4 centuries of historical examples of societies that practiced mass childhood cruelty, subsequently producing generations of brutal and martially minded adults. The largest scale human experiment demonstrating the epigenetic effects of diet on psychology was unintentionally performed by the Germans in World War II. During the Dutch hunger winter of 1944, the Nazi occupation government stopped food going into Holland. More than 20,000 Dutch citizens died of starvation. Epidemiologists have studied the effects of this social catastrophe on subsequent generations. They found that the offspring of women exposed to famine during this time had a much higher incidence of schizophrenia as adults, the result of the epigenetic effects on the fetus of dietary deprivation. Grill believes that societies that introduced enlightened elements of child nurturing became less violent and martial in subsequent generations, and more prone to direct their energies into a quest for justice and equality. This led to social innovations. In the American colonies, in the 18th century, children were often raised to be independent and outspoken. Visitors remarked on finding confident children who were not afraid to speak their minds, and these were the mothers and fathers of the authors of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. The nurturing of children has other intergenerational social consequences. The author of the best-selling book, Freakonomics, proposes a novel and provocative explanation for the dramatic decrease in violent crime in America from the early 1900s onward. The roots of this phenomenon long baffled social analysts. How could crime in a country drop by such a huge percentage in such a short time? Explanations like better policing or longer incarceration are inadequate to explain such a marked shift. The answer comes from an unlikely source: the establishment of legal abortion on demand. When unwanted children could be aborted, many accidental or unplanned pregnancies were ended this way, and women who were economically or psychologically unable to or unwilling to raise their babies had the option of abortion, and many exercised their new legal right. Well, this meant that most of the babies born were wanted by the mother, father, or both. These children presumably received better nurturing than the unwanted children of the pre-abortion era. The availability of abortion may have created an abrupt decrease in the number of neglected babies, and an abrupt increase in the number of nurtured babies. We now know that nurturing initiates epigenetic signals that produce less fearful and anxious adults. 20 years after the legalization of abortion, when both groups had grown up, the pool of violent adults had shrunk, leading to the sudden and precipitous drop in the crime rate. Without knowing it, society, by legalizing abortion, had made an epigenetic intervention that resulted in less violence a generation later. Nurtured children produce a more peaceful society. The epigenetic social cycle. One of the best-known proponents of early childhood nurturing is Michael Odent, M.D., a legendary French obstetrician. Odent groups together the child's time in the womb, birth, and first year into what he calls the primal period, which he believes is formative of many key adult attributes. He says that when researchers explore behavior, a personality trait, or a disease that can be interpreted as an impaired ability to love, they always detect risk factors in the prenatal period. He cites studies that show that the main risk factor for being a violent criminal at age 18 was the association of birth complications, together with early separation from or rejection by the mother. From studies among mammals as diverse as rats, hamsters, sheep, goat, and monkeys, one can conclude that there is always, immediately after birth, a short sensitive period which will never be repeated, and which is critical to mother-baby attachment and subsequent development. A chain of social events, which I call the epigenetic social cycle, is discernible here. Nurturing of children produces beneficial gene changes, which produces increased nurturing of subsequent generations, and a less violent and safer society. This, in turn, leads to the synthesis of fewer stress proteins in individuals, and greater production of cell repair hormones such as DHEA. Less stressed individuals are in turn more likely to contribute to social peace. The same epigenetic social cycle can also lead to a descending spiral of fear, anxiety, and violence. The failure of a society to nurture its children creates an epigenetic intervention that suppresses their ability to handle stress. They're more fearful and anxious and more prone to offensive or defensive violence. A violent society is unconducive to childhood nurturing, leading to further epigenetic gene modulation and even greater stress. This leads to increased violence. These cycles are by no means evident to the fields of medicine and psychology at the moment. Epigenetics is too new for its impact to be assimilated and understood. Epigenetics explains the success of interventions that look like magic to the existing medical and psychotherapeutic models, and is likely to take several years or even decades to penetrate into daily practice, even though the social benefits of positive interventions are clear. The reaction of the old guard. It will be fascinating to see how conventional medicine handles the challenges posed by energy medicine and energy psychology. Some of the key players in the current system have a lot to gain by embracing it, while others have a lot to lose. For instance, HMOs, hospitals and doctors being paid fixed rates for the number of patients they see, called capitation in the jargon of the profession, benefit financially the healthier a patient is. Average amount spent per person for health care was $6,683 in the United States in 2005. A provider who is receiving $6,683 from a patient who is so healthy that he or she makes one or no doctor's visits a year and uses only a few complementary and alternative therapies to assist in maintaining peak health, ends the year with a big profit. A provider dealing with a chronically ill patient, on the other hand, can spend more than $6,683 in a single week of treatment, and the patient rushed into intensive care can cost more than $6,683 in a single day. This figure is projected to rise to $12,320 per person in 2015. That's one reason why Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest HMOs, much studied for its efficiency, now offers Qigong classes, meditation classes, chiropractic, acupuncture, addiction recovery classes, and other strategies to make people happier and healthier. Some Kaiser practitioners also use energy psychology techniques. It's not just good health care, it's good business. And such organizations are net winners when people are healthy. Chronic disease is estimated to cost the U.S. economy a staggering $1.3 trillion each year. 40 million Americans could avoid chronic diseases by making modest lifestyle improvements, and the economic impact of disease would be reduced by $1.1 trillion. So society as a whole is a net winner when people get unstressed and happy and take care of their bodies. Others are net losers when quick and effective new therapies arrive. Psychotherapists with patients who have been seeing them weekly for many years, working on life issues, at an average visit cost of $100, lose an ongoing revenue stream of $5,000 a year when a patient settles an issue with energy psychology in a session or two. Such therapies pose a financial threat. They also suffer from a credibility gap. A therapist may rightly be skeptical that a patient's chronic agoraphobia, for example, can be cured in an hour, when years of therapy have produced only modest gains. Long term, however, therapists often report financial benefits from using energy psychology, quite aside from the professional satisfaction of seeing their patients get better. The financial benefit comes in being able to charge more per session and overcoming the likelihood that people avoid therapy because it takes too long, says Fred Gallo, Ph.D., who coined the term energy psychology and has authored several books on the subject. When the healing professions see their revenue streams threatened, they sometimes act in ways that protect their pocketbooks but hurt their patients. In the early 1900s in New York, Mary Mullen, an immigrant from County Tyrone, Ireland, later to be known as Typhoid Mary, infected dozens of people with typhoid fever, several of whom died. Though she was herself healthy, she passed the infection along in the course of her work as a cook for wealthy families, often through her favorite dish of iced peaches. Typhoid fever, caused by a strain of salmonella bacteria, is spread by poor hygiene, and in Mary's case, denial, since she believed she was healthy. She maintained her innocence even when doctors confronted her with evidence to the contrary. And to be fair, there was no scientific consensus at the time that a person could carry a disease without an active infection. Mary strenuously resisted efforts by Dr. Josephine Baker of the New York City Health Department to have her removed from circulation. Dr. Baker tried twice to have her quarantined, in one case sitting bodily on Typhoid Mary till the police could cart her away. Dr. Baker also trained mothers to wash their hands, limiting the spread of the epidemic. She also insisted that older siblings, who often cared for their younger brothers and sisters, maintain good hygiene too. Dr. Baker's success in controlling the spread of typhoid and cholera roused the ire of the traditionalists of her day. 30 Brooklyn pediatricians petitioned the mayor to pull the plug on her activities because the supply of sick children being brought into their lucrative practices was drying up. Today, a conventional medical system, under threat from many fronts, has to confront new therapies that can heal patients much faster and in many cases more cheaply than conventional approaches. Some react with ridicule, scorn, dismissal, and an unscientific refusal to honestly consider the facts. Yet, surfing through the energy psychology websites reveals the names of thousands of physicians, social workers, psychiatrists, and psychologists who have eagerly trained in these new methods for the benefits of their clients and patients. Energy tapping is to the 20th century what hand washing was to the 19th. It's a technique that's so simple and accessible and low-tech it doesn't seem possible that it can deliver the results that it promises. It requires no expensive gadgetry, elaborate explanations, board certification, years of professional training, university degrees, or membership in prestigious societies. It seems preposterous to those with an investment in today's medical system that energy tapping could have such powerful results. Yet clinical practice is proving the worth of this method every day, and science is rapidly providing a base of evidence for the efficacy of this simple intervention. Clearly, as a society, we should be studying the best examples of healing we can find, even if they seem like quackery or storytelling at first glance, and apply these principles for the benefit of all sick people. And we must sharpen our focus on a paradigm of health that seeks optimal, vibrant wellness, instead of one that allows unrecognized low-level malaises to mature into full-blown diseases, which we must then treat, often causing misery in the patient while squandering large sums of money. Emotional peace in the wake of war. 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Yet it is only in the last century that we've seen institutions emerge to study and develop the skills to make peace. The League of Nations was a first faltering step on an international scale. The United Nations is far from perfect, yet has catalyzed peace in many regional conflicts that would have been worse without UN intervention. One of those is Kosovo. Though a province of Serbia, only a minority of the population was Serbian. When the Kosovars became politically restive, the Serbian army went in. Civilians were attacked and in some cases massacred. The Serbian army used rape as an instrument of intimidation, as it had earlier done in Bosnia and Croatia. Thousands of Kosovars fled. The Serbians ignored appeals from the European Union and the UN to stop the killing and violence. Only when the United States, under President Bill Clinton, began a high-altitude bombing campaign were the Serbs eventually deterred. The volunteer team of energy psychology practitioners who went to Kosovo wrote that survivors experienced complete recovery from the post-traumatic effects of 247 of the 249 memories of torture, rape, and witnessing the massacre of loved ones that were treated. The Chief Medical Officer, Surgeon General of Kosovo, wrote the following letter of appreciation. Many well-funded relief organizations have treated the post-traumatic stress here in Kosovo. Some of our people had limited improvement, but Kosovo had no major change or real hope until we referred our most difficult patients to the International Treatment Team. The success from TFT was 100% for every patient, and they are still smiling until this day. And indeed, in formal follow-ups, at an average of 5 months after the treatment, each was free of relapse. Similar results have been shown to work with Hurricane Katrina survivors, Pakistani earthquake survivors, and those dealing with the effects of other disasters. Charles Figley, founder of Green Coast, which addresses the psychological needs of disaster victims, has said that energy psychology is among the most powerful interventions available to us. In June 2006, Sarah Bird and Paul O'Connor, Irish humanitarian volunteers, traveled to Kashmir to help earthquake victims, and they were shocked at what they saw. 8 months after the earthquake, Muzaffarabad is still a hellhole for the people who lost everything, and they are still living in tents, shanties, and hut-like structures. There was huge devastation there. The mountains swallowed up whole communities, and the figure that they are talking about unofficially is closer to 200,000 deaths. They worked with school children as well as in the hospitals. They had many profound encounters, of which this is typical. We went to see the head psychiatrist on our arrival, and he had a woman in with him who was seeing him for the first time. She had lost her children and hadn't been able to sleep since the earthquake, and she was complaining of severe headaches. When we went into his room, she was softly banging her head on his desk. After about 5 minutes of this, I could not watch any more, and I asked him if I could sit with her. I just tapped her hand until she raised her head, and then held her head in that tap pose until she relaxed. The doctor was translating. She said she felt lighter, but the head was still bad. So we tapped some more, and you could see her visibly relax. The doctor gave her some medicine for the head, but also told her to use TAT every day. Fred Luskin, Ph.D., whose Stanford Forgiveness Project has taught thousands of people how to let go of wounds and resentments, has offered similar trainings in other troubled parts of the world. Luskin says, resolving such resentment replaces hostile feelings with positive ones that make your body feel calm and relaxed, which enhances health. In one of his studies, 17 adults from Northern Ireland who lost a relative to terrorist violence received a week of forgiveness training. their mental distress dropped by about 40%, and they saw a 35% dip in headaches, back pain, and insomnia. EMDR has a humanitarian assistance project, which has worked in the Middle East, and in New York after September 11, and in many other troubled spots around the globe. The following story comes from the efforts of a team in Palestine. In one memorable instance, a Palestine father of 4 underwent EMDR as part of the EMDR Humanitarian Assistance Project. When he began the session, he was filled with homicidal rage toward all Israelis. At the end of the session, he reported feeling much better and spoke these words: "You must always remember, where there is life, there is hope." In the 18 months since his session, this man has tirelessly worked to establish EMDR programs for children in West Bank refugee camps. He's given permission for his story to be told in order that others might also have hope. The effects of such improvements in people's lives has great benefits to society as a whole. A study that tracked the clinical outcomes of 714 patients treated by 7 therapists using thought-field therapy, TFT, in an HMO setting, found that decreased subjective distress followed the treatment was far beyond chance, with 31 of 31 psychiatric diagnostic categories, including anxiety, major depression, alcohol cravings, and PTSD. Just imagine if every patient had access to such therapies as a routine part of treatment. Savings from the social costs of alcoholism and depression alone would far outweigh the costs of treatment. Ill will between warring factions and groups could be treated before it reaches out to devastate the whole society, and conflicts could be diffused before they become conflagrations with all the resulting human tragedy. Another organization that uses energy psychology and energy medicine interventions to treat disaster victims in developing nations is called Capacitar. Capacitar founder Patricia Mathis Kane, Ph.D., has worked in most Central American nations, including Guatemala, which was ravaged by a 35-year civil war. During the war, there were instances in which the entire population of men and boys in a village was shot and the bodies buried in mass graves. The degree of psychological trauma of the survivors, mostly women, is hard to overstate. Dr. Kane has found energy psychology techniques, especially TFT, to be invaluable in treating such people. She's written several workbooks in both English and Spanish to guide relief workers and others in these situations. She believes that energy psychology techniques are actually culturally more appropriate for such populations than traditional psychotherapy. In her book, Trauma Healing and Transformation, she writes often the client-therapist model does not fit the needs of grassroots people who, for most of their lives, have been disempowered by state, church, educational, and medical institutions. Self-treatment can avoid triggering the power dynamics inherent in the psychotherapy techniques with which most therapists and their clients are familiar. The story of an angry, violent man that begins this chapter is drawn from an important journal article on the treatment of people in disaster zones. It surveyed 20 years of experience by many practitioners who, like Patricia Kane, reported marked improvements after energy psychology treatments. Whether the disasters were human-caused, like civil wars, or naturally occurring like earthquakes, those using treatments with survivors reported the lifting of troublesome memories, stress reduction, and an increased ability to put the past behind them and get on with their lives. The report recommends moving energy psychology to the front line of disaster relief. Wanted 1,000 people. Under the impact of changes in consciousness, our social DNA is changing as surely as our physical DNA does. The cells of the immune system are few in number compared to the trillion cells of our bodies, yet they play a dominant role in keeping the whole organism healthy. Every cell in the body does not have to be an immune system cell in order to fight off infection. It only takes a few. In the same way, it does not require that all of the individuals in a society wake up in order for the whole of the society to wake up. It does require a critical mass, but that mass can be surprisingly small. Remember that the Renaissance, a cultural earthquake that completely transformed medieval society in just 25 years, was sparked by a mere 1,000 people. Like the few who sparked the Renaissance and changed the world forever, today we are witnessing a new revolution fomented by just a few thousand courageous volunteers who are aware not just of the effects of their own thoughts and feelings on their genetic expression, but of themselves as the change agents for society. By transforming their own consciousness, they are spearheading the transformation of the whole. They model what a transformed person can look like. They are the social genes that activate the immune machinery of an entire society. Are you one of them? If you are one of the many thousands of people who have read this book, you have already self-selected yourself as one of those social catalysts. To an individual gene, the task of getting a trillion-celled organism to change looks formidable, even though we know that the organism must awaken if it is to survive. Awakening is urgent. Yet once you realize you're acting in concert with a system, that you are not isolated, that your mind and your experience are subject to quantum entanglement in a multiverse of possibilities, then everything changes. The little effects that you have in your daily life become part of one large effect. Now that effect is large enough to change the world. It already has. And the results of humanity becoming a conscious co-creator in the great ecology of being are beyond our wildest dreams.